Hi, I thought I'd make a video about what ISIS is because you see, I'm reading a lot of things recently and people talking about it. It's in the news and everything, but I think it can be really confusing for a lot of people to really know what ISIS is exactly. It's one of those things that people throw the term around a lot, but they never really explain what it is exactly. And a lot of people say very simplified things about what they think it is, but more often than not, they're quite wrong. So I thought I'd clear it up a little bit with what I understand ISIS is, because I've read quite extensively about a lot of subjects surrounding ISIS, and I think I have a very good understanding about what it is. ISIS, ISIS is no single thing. ISIS is actually like an arrangement of a lot of smaller factors and a lot of smaller things that existed before what we see currently as the Islamic State. I mean, there's a reason that it's a little bit odd that all of a sudden there's an army and huge swaths of land have just suddenly been taken over by this thing called ISIS, which is the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. And there's a reason why it's unusual. It's not coincidence. It is actually very unusual. This sort of thing would happen. No army just pops out of nowhere. So I'm going to go into a little bit about what each part of it is. See, a lot of it is about what Al-Qaeda's original mission was. Now, I'm not saying that the two things are the same thing, but they have very similar missions. You see, Al-Qaeda was founded on the basis that they wanted to create a new caliphate. The caliphate was the government created by Muhammad back when the Islamic religion started. And following him, there was a number of leaders that came after him that took over control of this Islamic State that they all see as this point of extreme pride in their history, this one point where they weren't dominated by foreign powers. The Arab people were essentially in charge of their own destiny, and they were allowed to have an Islamic State. Obviously, we also have the Islamic State of Iran, but that's not seen as quite the same thing. That's also a Shia government as opposed to a Sunni government, which is obviously extremely different, and it favors Shia very strongly. See, Al-Qaeda was founded as sort of a byproduct of all the injustices that were taken against the Arabs throughout the last few hundred years. And that's why they wanted to create this resurgent version of the caliphate. They want to go back to a time when Arabs and Muslims had a great deal more pride in the world. They weren't essentially these people sitting on oil, they're getting kicked around by the West all the time. They actually had their own civilization and their own people and their own pride and their own language and religion, and everything was under their own control. And they sort of want to return to those days because, honestly, the West has abused them to no end over the last few centuries, and we should be acutely aware of the role we've played in the history of development of the Middle East. Not only that, but by supporting the existence of countries like Israel, which in the Arab countries is referred to as Al-Nakba, the Day of Disaster, which is when Israel took over all of Palestine. So we can see that we've supported what they think of as a disaster, and I can't blame them for thinking that. So they want to get away from this current era where we define everything about them. We define most of their borders. I mean, most of the borders from the Pikes-Sykes Agreement, which is where the English and French drew up the borders of all the Arabic countries, and they honestly don't necessarily match what the tribal identities are and everything. We've just sort of drawn a line on a map, and it's nonsense by and large to the local cultures. So the core mission of the Caliphate Revival is basically to recreate this old sense of the government, old sense of Arab and Islamic State, where there is progress and pride, and they're not just being kicked around. It's a strong state. And they want to go back to that. I can't blame them, and that's the purpose of Al-Qaeda. That's what Al-Qaeda wants to do. That's their mission. And that's why they're called Al-Qaeda. It means the base. The base is basically meant to be the foundation for this caliphate to grow up around them. I don't agree with the way Al-Qaeda went about it, obviously. They decided that the smartest way to create the caliphate and to revive it was to basically get America to invade the Middle East. And all the Arab countries would rise up and unite together and fight them off. And that would be the seed for a new Islamic State, which would cover the entire Middle East. Obviously, they picked something very intelligent. They destroyed a huge building and killed thousands of people in New York City, and America did exactly what they thought they would. They attacked into the Middle East, but obviously the next part of the plan didn't really come through necessarily, but we'll get into that a bit more later. So the core piece of ideology behind ISIS would probably be Al-Qaeda or something similar to Al-Qaeda. I don't know exactly how it's divided up in the Middle East. There's a lot of groups that have very similar ideas. Al-Qaeda is kind of the one we identified the strongest, but there are others as well in the area. So the Al-Qaeda central mission with all their planning and all their money and all their criminal networks and all the people that they know, that is the central tenet behind ISIS, but it's just a fundamental little core at the middle of it. Around that, of course, you have the fact that it's so deep into Syria. This comes from the fact that you have all these Syrian fighters. So all these people that may have at one point joined the FSA, the Free Syrian Army, which is opposing the Assad government, a lot of them were very religiously minded and very tribally minded and a lot of different things that was counter to the dominant Alawite tribe, which is what Assad is part of. The Islamic parts of the resistance, the FSA, started to possibly think that they'd have a better chance of freeing Syria with a larger coalition of Arab fighters rather than just the Free Syrian Army. Not only that, but it's Islamic. It's more Islamic. The FSA is meant to be moderate, and that's why the West supports it. They don't want another Islamic state. So seeing an Islamic option instead turning up that might get rid of Assad, as well as free Syria, as well as become more Islamic, a lot of FSA, seasoned fighters for the last few years could easily change their mind and go off and join ISIS instead. And so there's a large number of people that come from the resistance and the civil war that's been going on in Syria. The other and extremely crucial thing here is the fact that when America invaded Iraq back in 2003, they disbanded the Iraqi army. So they invaded and they went straight to Baghdad. There's a huge army, covering a lot of Iraq. And they got to the capital of Baghdad and they said, "We've won." Iraq said, "Yep, guess you have." Basically, you've destroyed all the things that were in your way and you've got to the capital. There's still a huge army left. And they disbanded it. Basically, as one of their first decisions was disbanding the army, along with debuffification, which is basically getting rid of everyone that had anything to do with Saddam Hussein, which was everyone, because you couldn't be in the government if you didn't. And so they disbanded huge parts of the government and they disbanded the entire army. So basically, you have an army that's sitting there who needs the work, and then suddenly they all don't have jobs. But they're all trained military personnel with an existing rank structure, with existing tribal loyalties, with people that all know how to do all their jobs. There are all these equipment depots hidden all over the country that a lot of them might know the location of, and a lot of them might have training in all kinds of military tactics. And you've just told them all that they don't have jobs anymore. And so basically you've validated the insurgency immediately by turning up, taking away their jobs and saying, "We've taken over your country." And so a lot of them didn't have any other opportunity for work, but joining the insurgency actually paid, because there's a lot of foreign money going into the insurgencies from places like Saudi Arabia. And so you could actually make money being in the insurgency. So that was the next choice. So there was a matter of pride, there was a matter of money, there's a matter of the fact that you feel like you're invaded. There's a matter of the fact that you feel like you're not appreciated at all by the new people running the country. And so they joined the insurgency instead to get rid of the people that invade their country. And they basically overnight created a packaged insurgency ready to go the next day. And that's exactly what happened. So there's a lot of people that still don't want to join the new Iraqi army, and instead they got used to being insurgents and countering the West. And maybe a lot of them feel a bit more brave after some time, like they realize they're not being killed, they're not being slaughtered, they're actually having some success. And so they say, yes, we're going to keep countering the West. So you have huge numbers of trained military personnel who now have a decade of resistance experience joining ISIS. So you've got war veterans from Syria, you've got war veterans from Iraq, you've got a hardcore Al-Qaeda center, like that's the kernel of the group that holds a lot of it together. That's the core ideology that's driving a lot of what ISIS wants, which is the resurrection of the Islamic State and the creation of a new caliphate. On top of that, also, you have a lot of groups that Al-Qaeda is linked with, and that's what I mean by the network that I said earlier. You have foreign fighters, so from Chechnya, Pakistan, other people from Syria and Lebanon, and people from Saudi Arabia, people from Yemen and Oman. You have all these people from all over the area that have different skills, different families, different networks, different amounts of money. You have some very, very rich people and some very, very poor people. And all these people are coming from different walks of life to sort of support this central mission that Al-Qaeda has, re-establishing the caliphate, so re-establishing a new state for the Middle East that's not defined by the West. And that obviously is an extremely, extremely tempting prospect for a lot of people who have probably seen a lot of combat and a lot of people that might have seen a lot of friends and family die due to Western military intervention. And this is the kind of constant thing that has sort of led to ISIS coming together. It's this slow amalgamation of weapons and equipment and money and skill and knowledge and belief and pride and all these other factors, as well as just wanting Islam to be more of the dominant force. So they're honestly, at this point, that's less of a focus. Even though it's called the Islamic State, it's less of a focus than the fact that they just identify Islam as being Arabic, as being resistance, as not being the West. Like the further you go into Islam, the further you get away from the West. And so it becomes a bit of an identification point for people who are in ISIS to resist against the West. So basically, the goal is reasonably understandable if you think of it from their point of view. And that's why it's got so many supporters, and that's why it's got such a large amount of land, and that's why they're pushing into Syria, they're pushing into Iraq, they're even pushing east, and that's why a lot of people are so scared of them. That's why a lot of people in the West are so scared of them, is the fact that they have a solid mission, they're making progress, they have the equipment. And our reaction, though, is more often than not just to say, you're doing a bad thing, we need to bomb you. I do agree with the fact that the tactics by which they're pursuing this are very violent and very in line with the fundamental principles of a lot of Islamic laws. So they're still beheading people. They're still, supporting forced marriages with, girls who are children. They're still killing anyone who's not, obeying a lot of Islamic tenets, in certain areas. This is some part I don't know exactly, but I wouldn't be surprised at all if certain parts of the ISIS territory are being rigidly controlled and some of them aren't, because the huge array of people that have come to sort of create ISIS and what it is. And the army that's popped out of nowhere, because it didn't pop out of nowhere, it came from all the areas around them. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of those groups were a lot less hardline than the others, but they all still identify with the central Islamic State leadership, even though they're all sort of like warlords. They all have their own agendas, their own ways they want to run things, so you're going to have groups that are going to kill everyone and groups that aren't. It's not like the US military where you have an extremely rigid rank structure. This is much more about association, like a federation of clans almost, where people have very strong ideas about how they want to run things within their territories. So, of course, we come next to the idea of the foreign fighters. We've heard a lot about this, especially in Australia, where people are going over to join the fight in Syria or something like that. And they're saying, no, you shouldn't go over there, you shouldn't join that fight, that's illegal, we want to stop people going over there and joining the fight. When it comes to Syria itself, I don't understand why we do that, honestly. I think the fight against Assad is completely legitimate. I think he's a very tyrannical dictator, and he deserves to be deposed. But I think it's only really become a problem. Like, they've only really focused on it now that ISIS has appeared, because people think people are going to join ISIS. And look, again, if they're trying to get rid of Assad at the moment, the best thing you can do is probably join ISIS. I mean, they're the strongest force that's fighting against the Assad government in the Middle East, because no one else seems to be making as much progress as they are. But of course, you also can't support them because they're killing a lot of other people, like the Kurds, and people that just don't want to follow hardline Islam in the groups that are pushing that. And as you often get with war veterans, people get very jaded and very harsh. And of course, the people who are Syrian veterans have seen a lot of death, and they're probably at the point now where they're willing to support ISIS's party line extremely strongly. So you can't agree with the way they're doing things, even if you can understand why they're doing it. So you almost have a situation with the FSA. You have the FSA, you've got the Assad government, and you've got ISIS, and only the FSA is relatively good in that clash. They're all pretty bad. So when you say go to join ISIS, that's a terrible thing. I can see why they're doing it. But the kind of thing they're going to end up supporting and the kind of actions that they're going to end up supporting are going to be immoral. So you do need to stop them. You do need to stop them from going over there if you can avoid it. But it's a very murky, grey moral area, and I'm not sure exactly where I stand on it, because I can understand at the same time I have to reprimand both sides of this topic. So I would default to stopping them, but again, it's a murky grey area that I'm open to discussion about, because I'm not sure exactly where I feel about the idea of the foreign fighters going over there to help from our country. I mean, the fact is it's a practical concern a lot of the time as well, because the West is no stranger to supporting tyrannical regimes. They just don't like supporting tyrannical regimes that aren't going to help them. So you have a lot of countries that have been doing a lot of very shady things over the last 100 years. In particular, America supports a lot of these countries, like Panama and like Venezuela before Chavez, and like Pinochet and Saddam Hussein before they had a disagreement and he tried to invade Kuwait. There's quite a few things throughout history as well. I'm drawing a couple of blanks, but there's definitely a lot of times that America has supported tyrannical regimes. It's no new thing. It's just ISIS is Islamic, and they don't like Islamic powers because they're fundamentally anti-West most of the time, and that doesn't work for America. So if they were killing everyone in their way, and they were America's best friends, you'd probably see very different news reports. So you have to take everything with a little bit of a grain of salt. The fact that we're painting them the light we are is because they're very inconvenient. You see huge amounts of death and killing on the part of Israel's government. I mean, they're always causing mass amounts of violence in the areas around them, in particular the Gaza Strip. But we don't hear much from America about how bad that is, because they're very close friends. So take everything with a grain of salt when you hear these reports about how evil someone is in particular, because you have to remember that it's all based on how convenient they are to the American empire, essentially. So we come to the final question, is terrorism and ISIS. Now, terrorism is a bit of a strange term that we use a lot, and we sort of use anything that's against, anything where a civilian dies and it was state-sanctioned and we don't like it, it's terrorism. Anything where a civilian dies and it's state-sanctioned but we do like it, it's collateral damage. Anything where a civilian doesn't die, obviously it's just a mission. And it's a perfect one, apparently. So ISIS's use of terrorism is going to be very similar to Al-Qaeda's use of terrorism, in that if they do it, it's going to be for a reason. It's all driven for a purpose. So you got to ask yourself, what is ISIS's mission before you attack before you think about this, because any terrorist attack is going to cost time, it's going to cost huge amounts of money. It could potentially get caught halfway through by any one of the counterterrorism agencies. And so there's a very high risk for everyone involved, and there's a very high money value and effort value, and it's years of investment. What's going to deliver the result they want? So the result they want is to basically have the new caliphate. Now, they actually have a landmass. It's not like Al-Qaeda, the tiny little terrorist group that they had before, where they were trying to get everyone else to unite. There's actually already a geographical land that they control. So anything that they do is going to be for the mission of keeping that land and growing it, because that's what they want. Potentially, they also want all the other countries to unite around them, but obviously they've learned that doesn't work, or they've learned that it's not going to happen. The only thing that's going to make something like that happen is if Israel then tries to invade everyone around them and take a bit more land, although they're very slowly doing it with the settlements. I'm talking about quick, explosive, lots of guns, lots of explosions sort of thing. That's the only thing that's really going to make a big resistance or a big change. So what you have is a state that has a mission, and that mission is to keep its land or grow. So what are they going to do? What's the best plan for that? So that is basically, one, you don't want the West to be involved. As much as possible, you don't want the West to be involved. Because if the West is involved, you're outgunned. Like, as soon as the West turns up with the militaries that we have, we could wipe every ISIS member off the face of the earth if we want to do bad enough. Like, it's very simple. America alone could send a carrier group, a couple of regiments of Marines with armored support and planes or something, and they could destroy everything in their way, and they would have no problem. Because that's the nature of the disparity between military strengths between the West and ISIS and anything in that area. So at the moment, they're not committed that strongly. You see, like at the moment, we've got planes. They're bombing. They're just bombing and bombing and bombing, and mostly they're relying on Arabic forces, so Iraqi army, Kurdistan forces, Free Syrian army to some degree, the Assad regime, ironically to some degree, and just people around, just other groups around that area. Those ones are the main ones that are involved at the moment. And so if you think about what ISIS wants to not have any more enemies. They have enough enemies. They have enough of the West bombing them and the rest of the Arabic countries shooting at them on the ground. They don't need more enemies than they already have, because it's just going to make it harder and harder, and potentially that will just mean they'll lose the territory and it'll turn back into an insurgency like it has been for the last 10 years. And that's not progress at all, because eventually they're going to have to work themselves back to the point they're at now. So what they want is the West not to be involved. So if you think about the nature of terrorism, what I think is that there's a lot of people in the West who sympathize, like people of certain descents, like Arabic descents, like strong Muslim descents, and are generally probably disenfranchised people who strongly sympathize with the cause that ISIS is representing. And those people, they take it upon themselves to find people who can tell them more about it. They find people who can give them information. They try and go looking for weapons. They try and go looking for things like that. And they do stuff on their own. Like that guy that they got in Melbourne, who tried to stab 2 people and they shot him. I have pretty strong doubts that he was like a sanctioned operative that was ready to do something. I think he was probably just a person who has very strong sympathies for ISIS and took it upon himself to militarize himself. And thus, when they cornered him, he reacted the way he did, you know. Some people are just going to do that. I mean, look at what happened in Norway with that guy that wiped out that whole camp. He was a white Christian. He was just a white Christian nationalist. I mean, you can see that kind of intensity that drives people to do stuff like that when it's like all a perceived threat that happened there. This is something that's actually a war going on. It's actually people that have been subjected to Western rule for 500 years that's finally being, that's coming to a head, and that's all the information that they're reacting from. So it's a far more understandable, and that's why I think there's quite a few people in the West. And as long as the war happens, they're going to keep appearing. The harder you clamp down, the more legitimate they're going to feel. And the harder we clamp down on the Muslim communities in the West, the more legitimate they're going to feel, and the more of them that will spring up, and the more hardcore they'll become. They are only developing because of how hard we're clamping down on them, and how hard we're clamping down on the war in the Middle East. So, if you think that there's going to be some kind of operation here, some kind of terrorist attack in a country like Australia, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. It doesn't make sense. Because all they're doing is wasting energy and time and investment on bombing a country that has a very low population density, that has a almost negligible contribution to any military conflict that goes on. If you want a successful attack on a civilian population, like for whatever reason, just go straight for America. Just hit them again. That makes 1 billion times more sense than hitting Australia. So the people that are here currently getting paranoid about a terrorist attack is going to happen here, frankly, I think it's just the Conservative government making the most of the situation in order to ramp up the rules and clamp down on Muslims. Because honestly, our Prime Minister is Christian, often anti-woman, anti a lot of things, anti-progress by the seam of things, by the way he takes money out of everything except the stuff that we should really be taking money out of. Look at everything skeptically. I mean, realize what the real threat is to do with ISIS, realize what they're really representing, and just think for yourself. Because they're not going to attack Australia. It's ridiculous. There's no reason to. There's no reason to waste that amount of effort. Not to mention, there's probably no reason for them to attack the West at all, because they're just hurting themselves if they do. So, with that, I would say we should not be clamping down harder here in the West, because it's counterproductive. As for supporting the war in the Middle East, I have to say yes. I have to say we do need to be a bit more involved, because frankly, the way that they're going about this thing that I would call legitimate, like I would say them trying to create a new caliphate, fair enough after what we've done to them for the next 500 years, for the last 500 years. But the way they're going about it, we can't excuse. We can't allow it to be the way it is. We can't allow all the killing, all the hardcore amoral rules. I mean, it's amoral according to our moral compass, but I believe that it's a universal moral compass, and that's why it's written up by the UN. I think there's a lot standing for it. I think defending women and equality and standing against religious persecution and all those sorts of things, like that's fundamental. That's important. And we can't really argue that that's just what they believe. It's just true. We have to stop that kind of thing. So we do have to fight ISIS. We do have to stop them from growing any larger than they are. We do have to bomb them. It's necessary. Which is a shame. Because I think we've worked them into a situation where this is the only way they think they can get out of it. And so we then have to bomb them back into the same situation. And possibly just create a harder, more Islamic, more militant core afterwards. I mean, you don't scare anyone into submission. It never happens. You don't bomb people until they submit. Not the tribal mentality that a lot of these areas have. You're going to bomb them and they're just going to hate you more afterwards, and they're just going to try again in a different way later. So, stop ISIS, yes. But possibly we need to think about the way that we deal with Middle Eastern countries and the way that our international relations are going with them. And even if it costs us money, even if it's less productive, less efficient, and less good for our economies, maybe we should start thinking about not trying to hold the Middle East into what it is right now and let it grow into something a little bit greater. So, should you be afraid of ISIS in the West? No, you shouldn't be. Do we need to do something about ISIS in the Middle East and the war that's going on there at the moment? Unfortunately, yes, we do need to do something about that. Is the government probably using most of the ISIS threat to drum up support to tighten rules more and more until they're much more convenient? They could spend more money on the military, take money away from things we actually want in the name of protection, and all kinds of other things like that? Yes. Especially in Australia, it's ridiculous how much that they're doing right now. So with that, rest easy, don't stress it out, take everything with a grain of salt, and I hope you sort of understand what ISIS is now. Anyway, thanks. See you later.